In the beginning, there was only the great Namu, the supreme deity of all that existed. Over time, the goddess Namu gave birth to two gods, Anu, god of paradise, and Ki, goddess of the earth. These two divine beings were considered one, and so they lived together for thousands of years, for Namu had given them to the world as a single entity, holding heaven and earth together. Anu and Ki grew to complement each other, and in time, they consummated their love, giving birth to Enlil, the god of the winds. Although both rejoiced at the arrival of their firstborn, as soon as he was born, Enlil separated his parents forever. He took Anu and carried him upward, away from his beloved Ki, and then carried Ki downward, away from Anu, thus leaving heaven and earth apart. After the birth of Enlil, Anu, the father god, had affairs with the goddess Namu, who later gave birth to Enki, becoming an important companion for Enlil and forming the great triad of powerful gods along with his father Anu. As he grew older, Enlil became Anu's successor, becoming the supreme leader of his pantheon and one of the most respected and feared gods in the universe. It was said that no one could be above him, and that his throne should always be higher than that of others, for he was the highest lord and princedom of the gods, with immense power. All the gods prostrated themselves before him. Enlil was the supreme ruler of the universe, thanks to his possession of the sinister and coveted Tablets of Destiny, a divine artifact made of clay containing the history of the cosmos, which gave its bearer the power to rule the entire universe. For thousands of years, creation was in charge of the lesser gods, who served the main gods and maintained order in the world. On Earth, these subordinate gods performed hard and cruel labor to satisfy the needs of their masters. So many years of slavery and mistreatment by the great gods, they finally tired the servants, who rebelled in fury. They went to several primordial gods. Some rejected them, but others sided with them, demanding freedom. Thus, they went to the temple of Enlil to present their complaints and demand a solution to so much suffering. The protests of the rebel gods intensified day by day, and their cries of resentment resounded in the temple of Enlil, who, from his throne, listened with concern to the disturbances occurring at the gates of his sanctuary. The mighty god Enlil was very disturbed by the great disturbances, so he immediately summoned Nuska, his advisor, seeking his recommendation in the face of the tragic situation. Nuska advised him to gather the gods to resolve the matter as soon as possible. Otherwise, Enlil might lose his sovereignty. She further informed Enlil about the demands of the subordinate gods and how, in their eagerness to be heard, they had organized themselves. Enlil then sent his advisor to the multitude of gods to find out who the leader of the rebellion was to settle the unrest. Nuska went to investigate and find out who was the leader of the gods with such demands, and upon hearing the requests of the subjects, he was perplexed. Each of us has declared war, and the mother goddess Belit Ili is on our side. We demand that the mother goddess be allowed to create our descendants, and that man bear the gods' responsibilities, as the Igwigwi expressed. Enlil's loyal advisor returned with the disturbing news to the temple, informing him that the gods were furious, so Enlil had to take immediate action. So, the great wind god decided to call an assembly of the higher gods to ask their advice about what was happening. When he brought them all together, Enlil explained the situation to them and, upset, demanded a solution. His father, Anu, recommended that he make peace with all the gods to preserve his great government, since things could get out of control and chaos could take over the universe, destroying it. So, Enlil had no choice but to allow the creation of mankind. Thus, among all the primordial gods, they begot their descendants, molded them, gave them advice, and left them on Earth. At first, they were very few, but as the years went by, they grew and grew. Finally, they were given the sacred mandates that they had to fulfill to the full for the stability of creation and of the gods themselves. They were warned that if they did not obey the rules imposed by the gods, they would be punished eternally. Humans then served the gods with great banquets and sacrifices, worked the earth and cared for it. thus allowing the gods to rest as men took care of their hard work. For many years, the creation of mankind seemed to be one of the best decisions of the gods. However, Enlil was not entirely pleased, for from the beginning he did not agree with the idea of creating an inferior being. Although men had facilitated the gods' tasks by becoming faithful servants, a new problem arose. The other gods supported Enlil's decision, as they were also fed up with the unbearable noise of humans, so they supported his plan and allowed a great plague to be unleashed on Earth to wipe out mankind. When Enlil's punishment came true, and the great plague hit the Earth, thousands of people suffered and died cruelly every day, screaming bloody with pain and begging the gods for their salvation. The mighty Enki, moved by the cruel suffering of the people, took pity on a man who prayed to him day and night. That man was the wise Atrahasis. "Merciful Enki, have mercy on your faithful worshippers. We need the pain and suffering to cease on earth, for soon there will be no one left," said Atrahasis. Enki, hearing his words, came to him and gave him great advice that would save mankind. "Tell all men to address their supplications and prayers to the god Namtar, the god of plague. When he hears that all prayers are for him, he will be ashamed for stealing the prayers of the other gods and will remove all plagues from the earth." As Enki advised, Atrahasis did so, and in a short time the great god Namtar removed all the plagues, thus stopping the massive death and suffering that was occurring. Enlil saw what happened and allowed it, for in that time of pestilence much of mankind had died, so he was satisfied. However, he warned men about the noise, threatening to destroy them if they corrupted his commands. Thousands more years passed, and the population again grew enormously. The volume of mankind's noise was too loud, so again Enlil could not sleep. This time, Enlil decided without consulting anyone so that the other gods would not interfere. He went in search of Predated, the god of rain and thunder, and asked him not to send a single cloud or drop of rain to earth to punish humans with a great drought that would cause famine and death until finally men would become extinct and the noise would end. Predated, obeying Enlil, let everything dry up, interrupting the rains and withdrawing the clouds, which triggered a terrible famine that killed thousands of people, just as Enlil wished. However, seeing the suffering of men, Atrahasis again implored the solidarity of Enki, who told him to do the same as before, and the problem was solved, for the rains returned and the famine ended. The population had been greatly reduced, so Enlil was able to fall asleep. After some time, the noise of mankind again disturbed Enlil, whose fury this time was extreme, for the uproar was uncontrollable. Determined to wipe out mankind, Enlil summoned an assembly of all the gods. Once the assembly of the gods heard the gods' furious words, they had no choice but to accept his sinister designs and orders. Enlil declared to all the gods that he would deprive humans of all sources of life until they finally became extinct, and assigned a god as custodian of a part of the earth so that men would not be allowed to pass on its resources. Thus, Enlil instructed the gods Anu and Adad to protect the heavens and not let a single drop of rainfall on earth. To Enki, he ordered him to be the guardian of the waters, having to do the same as his father. Finally, he said that he would be in charge of guarding the earth. At that moment, the gods took their positions as ordered by Enlil and began to deprive men of the gifts of nature. However, from his post, Enki continued to secretly help the humans, warning them of what was coming and asking them to stockpile food and provisions for the hard years ahead. Then, within a few months, famine came to earth and Enlil's wishes were fulfilled. For year after year, man's resources were depleted, extinguishing with them life itself. There was no more food to fill their stomachs, and their suffering was intense. Atrahasis again begged Enki to help him, for he had saved mankind in the past, and he still hoped that he could do so, for there was nothing left on Earth to survive on, and if the situation continued as it was, humans would soon cease to exist. Enki decided to assist him and told him that he would send abundant fish into the waters so that they could feed themselves and survive. Thus, secretly, Enki helped mankind for a short time, stopping the deaths. Meanwhile, Enlil was puzzled, for men seemed to increase rather than decrease, and spying on the gods, he discovered that his brother Enki was the betrayer of his designs. Furious, Enlil claimed him and told him that, as punishment, he must unleash a great flood that would wipe out all mankind. Enlil ordered Enki, as punishment, to unleash a great flood that would extinguish all mankind on earth, and this time he would be very attentive so that he would not disobey and ruin his plans. So, with regret, Enki sent a great flood that promised to spread out everything in existence. But under the oversight of Enlil, Enki was able to warn Atrahasis about the impending catastrophe so that he could save life on Earth and mankind from extinction. Before the flood came, Enki ordered Atrahasis to build a large boat and store food and animals so that mankind would have a new beginning when the flood subsided. So Atrahasis and his wife built what the god had recommended, and when the fury of Enlil, the wind god, struck the earth, they managed to save themselves and live to mark a new beginning, ordered by Enki. Enlil was pleased, for he would no longer hear the noise that bothered him, thanks to the punishment he had unleashed. However, when he looked closely, he saw a boat sailing in the descending waters, which infuriated him tremendously. Enlil thought that this was the work of Enki, so he lashed out in anger at his brother. However, Enki managed to calm his anger and convince him to allow a new beginning that would guarantee their peace. Enlil, persuaded by Enki's words, agreed to listen to his proposal and not to end the lives of Atrahasis and his wife, who were the only survivors. Thus, among all the gods, they ruled that Atrahasis and his consort would be the progenitors of the new humanity because they proved to be pure and noble people. Thus, the gods granted them immortality. For his part, Enlil reflected on how to prevent men from multiplying as last time, for he wished to have peace. This time, he made sure that 1/3 of the women and men were barren so that the stragglers would continue to serve the gods for eternity. Thus, a new beginning in creation had been marked, in which the gods would make sure that humans would not generate so many conflicts that would disturb their tranquility. During his youth, Enlil, on one of his many travels, met a beautiful goddess. When he saw her, he was mesmerized by her beauty and charm. The young woman was Ninlil, who was bathing alone in a beautiful river in the city of Kippur. As she was immersing herself, Ninlil heard a strange noise, so frightened she jumped out of the water immediately. Looking around, she realized that a man was peeping at her lustfully from behind the bushes. Terrified, Ninlil shouted at him to go away, for she wished to be alone. However, Enlil, blinded by his lust, slowly approached the river to be near her. Ninlil managed to see clearly that this was the god Enlil, so she kept warning him to go away, for she wanted nothing to do with him. The goddess turned her back on Enlil, and seeing her total rejection, the wind god turned away and left. Back at his temple, Enlil thought about how to conquer the beautiful woman, so he decided to seek out Nuska, his chief advisor, to ask for her help. When he arrived with Nuska, he said to him, "Do you know that beautiful woman who walks along the river every day? Her name is Ninlil, the most beautiful in the universe, and I wish to know more about her. Tell me, does she have any other suitors?" Then Nuska replied, "Come into my boat, Enlil. I will show you and give you Ninlil." So, they set off down the river to reach the beautiful goddess, who always strolled along the tributary. Time later, when the god achieved his goal, Ninlil had no choice but to stay by her husband's side, as she was carrying his child in her womb. Thus, she decided to stay by the god's side, and after several months, Enlil's eldest son was born, whom they named Nana, becoming the lunar deity. Meanwhile, Enlil continued his extensive travels around the world and decided to pay a visit to the temple of the deities. Upon entering, he was stunned to discover that the other gods already knew of his transgressions and had issued a search warrant. Upon seeing Enlil in the Kiur, several guards rushed upon him to apprehend him, following the divine order to arrest him for his grave transgressions. Once captured, he was brought before the assembly of the gods, who declared him impure and announced that his fault would not be forgiven, condemning him to the underworld. Expelled from heaven and earth, Enlil was sent to the realm of the dead to serve his punishment. Ninlil, worried and sensing something terrible, went in search of him. On her way to the Key Ur, she saw her husband being led out of the city and decided to follow him to stop his march. However, she did not manage to catch up with him at the city gates. Ninlil longed for Enlil to take responsibility for her, as they had shared intimate moments and he had left her homeless, so she had to accompany him wherever he was. Enlil, astute, realized that Ninlil was looking for him and devised a plan to avoid being judged again by the gods and be reunited with the beautiful deity. Arriving at the city gates, he said to the guard, "If you see the woman coming, if she asks for me, tell her that you don't know where I went." After uttering these words, Enlil assumed the form of the guardian to meet Ninlil. Already at the gates, Ninlil asked the guard for Enlil, to which he replied, "I do not know, my lady. I do not know your whereabouts." Distressed at not knowing where Enlil was, Ninlil was forced to continue her search to meet him. The guard, who was Enlil in disguise, began to deceive her with falsehoods until he finally consummated his desire for the young deity. After joining Enlil, Ninlil became pregnant, expecting Nergal, who would become the god of war. However, she continued her search for Enlil, who had departed for the underworld. Enlil, disguised by the river Edkura, deceived Ninlil, and from their union was born Ninazu, the deity of the waters. Later, Enlil, posing as a boatman, deceived Ninlil again, and she gave birth to Enbululu, the god of the canals. The sons became deities of the underworld while Enlil faced his punishment. Ninlil, determined, did not cease in her quest to find Enlil. Her journey took her to the Edkura, a river that separates the world of the living from the underworld. There, she found a mysterious hut and an unpleasant-looking man coming out of it. Ninlil, without hesitation, approached to ask him about Enlil. The man, who was Enlil in disguise, denied knowing anything, repeating the story of the guardian of Nippur. Deceived again, Ninlil became pregnant. Enlil, after making sure that Ninlil would follow him, continued on his way to the underworld. Ninlil, realizing the deception, decided to follow him. On his journey, he met an old boatman and asked him about Enlil. The boatman, Enlil in another form, took her down the river and deceived her again. During her journey to the underworld, her son Enbululu was born and became the god of the canals. And so the last three sons of Enlil became the three gods of the underworld, and their father, the god Enlil, was left to receive his punishment in the realm of the dead. What legacy did Enlil leave in the world? How does his story continue to inspire people to this day? This video has been created for Labyrinth of Crete. See you on the next adventure.